Thank you to all of you for joining. And the topic today is a tshuva that I co-authored with Rabbi Micah Peltz. Um, a tshuva, for those of you who don't know, is a legal responsum. It's essentially for thousands of years. Many people don't know. There are law codes that are a little bit more famous, things like the Shulchan Aruch or the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, and those are codifications of Jewish law, but there's a far, far greater body of material of what are called she'elot v'tshuvot, which means questions and answers. She'elot, questions, and teshuvot as answers, where essentially rabbis were sent questions from various communities, either from communities abroad. Many people sent questions to people like Maimonides. They wanted Maimonides to answer halachic questions for their community, and rabbis would send responses. Sometimes people would write them for their own communities, but there's a huge body of halachic literature of She'elot V'Tshuvot. The conservative movement has something called the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. It is comprised of 25 or 30 rabbis who are the voting members. There are also some representatives, I think, from the United Synagogue as well. And this is a group of people who essentially are asked questions that are relevant to the Jewish tradition now, and then tshuvot are written by members of the committee, and then essentially voted on. And if there is a minimum vote, and I actually forget what the minimum vote is, but there's sort of a minimum number of votes that you have to get, and if you get that minimum number of votes, then your tshuva becomes a official stance of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And Rabbi Mark Werbo, who's on the call, is helping me, and he helped me to remember it's 6 votes. So, by the way, what that can mean is, first of all, you can have a tshuva which is an official position of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, but that did not win a majority vote, right? So if there are 20 or 25 people who are voting and you only get 6 votes, you may have had 14 people vote against it, but there were 6 people on the committee who said, this sounds like sound halakha, this sounds like a reasonable approach to the Jewish tradition, and therefore it is one possible position of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And you can actually have contradictory tshuvot, right? So one tshuva might say that something is permitted, and another tshuva might say that something is forbidden, and both of those are understood to be valid positions of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And if that's the case, then the rabbi, and actually in every case, the rabbi of a particular community is what's called a Mara Da'atra. Mara is the Aramaic word for master, and Atra is the Aramaic word for aretz, for land, or makom, place. And so what it literally means is the master of the place. And what that means is certainly rabbis are not in charge of very much, but one thing which we are sort of given the final say on is determining what is permitted and forbidden for a particular community. And we are only the halakhic authorities for our particular community. So what may be permitted at my community might be forbidden in Rabbi Werbo's community in Washington, D.C., and vice versa. So that's how that process works. Marguerite joining us from South Africa, we say welcome, and hope you and your family are doing okay. I know things are difficult right now. So let me do this. What I want to do is to share my screen. And I'm going to just show you first, what is this whole thing called a committee, what is this whole thing of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards? So please, somebody confirm for me, can you see the RA website now on your screen, now that I've shared it? Yes? Okay, great. So this is the website of the Rabbinical Assembly. The Rabbinical Assembly is the worldwide organization for conservative rabbis. And then I'll just show you so you can find this. I am not logged in. There is a members only section, but I'm not logged in, so anybody can get to this. If you go to this place called Jewish Law, okay, and then you scroll down, there's this thing called Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And then there's like a database and 4 sections, okay? And you can, I think you can just click on the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards one, and it should take you, yeah, it takes you to sort of an introductory screen. And then you'll see that you can read all about this another time, but there are 4 areas by which Tshuvot are organized. These 4 areas are the same organizational principle that was used by first the Tur and then by Rabbi Yosef Karo when he put together the Shulchan Aruch, which means the arranged table. It is understood to be certainly a very authoritative, very important law code that was published in 1550 and then added on to, because it was a bunch of Sephardic opinions and the Ashkenazim have different practices. Rabbi Moshe Isserles came afterward and added what was called the Mapa, which basically means the tablecloth, to the set table. And so you have both Sephardic and Ashkenaz traditions. So this was the organizing principle of these 4, Orach Hayim, sort of the way of life, Yoreh Deah, teaching and knowledge, Even HaEzer, the helper, the rock and helper, and Choshen Mishpat, which are sort of matters of justice. So you can see there's a description of each one of these. I'm just going to go to mine. So the particular tshuva that I wrote falls under Yoreh Deah. It's in that category around mourning. You'll see it's more expansive than that. But when I click here, it will take you to the tshuvot on Yoreh Deah. There we go. And here are all of the different categories that are part of Yoreh Deah. And the tshuva that was published is in a section called Hilchot Bikur Cholim U'Refuah, visiting the sick and issues of medicine. And so if I click on here, if you look up at the top, the most recent tshuva under that category is listed here. When should a person come off of the communal list? And it's actually even given a categorization, Yoreh Deah 335.4, and it lists the year in which the tshuva was approved. So if I could click on this, and then it would bring up essentially the tshuva, and then you are welcome to download this and read it in its entirety. I will tell you, my tshuva is, I don't know, 14, 15 pages. If you get back into other ones, for example, I'm just going to show you, some of these get very, very long, and there's a lot of different issues that are covered here. Stem cell research, organ donation, and you can see the evolution, because some of these go back to 1999 and 2000 and even before that. Some of them are more recent. So you can see the evolution of Jewish law. But some of these are very, very complicated. You can look at any of these all the time. Okay, So let me now, I'm going to shift over to my tshuva in particular. And I'm going to do a little bit. I have not created a sheet for teaching this, with the particular sources yet. I think that's on the list of things to do. But this one is sort of hot off the presses. And so I'm going to do some of this by just sort of reading pieces of the tshuva, and some of this by skipping over and just sort of going over some of the sources. So I want to just begin with the first paragraph, which I'll read out loud right now. A few years ago, Rabbi Graber's wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. My wife, thank God, is fine these days. He prayed for her recovery before her surgeries and during her chemotherapy and radiation treatments, but it was unclear when to stop praying for her. Her hair was growing back, her strength was returning, except she still had a port, and she was still getting infusions every 3 weeks. And even when these were done, effects lingered and they carry the fear of cancer's return. And this last section is still true. Thank God, we feel like most of that is in the background, but Jennifer continues to be on medications. And so, and I wanted to read that as a beginning to say that when we look at questions of Jewish law, there is no such thing, or there should not be such a thing as, if you use Robert Cover's terms, nomos and narrative, as nomos is law and narrative is story. And whenever you're looking at a question of law, it always has a context and there's always a story behind it. And those stories are usually what give rise to questions. And so for me, this was the particular story that gave rise to a set of questions. Let me just say also that, I wasn't worried. I wasn't asking this question because I was worried that if I said an extra prayer that somehow God was going to strike me down, or that I have a theology, where I believed that if I stopped praying too soon, that somehow that was going to negatively affect Jen's recovery, God forbid. I didn't ask it from those places, but I also think that Jewish law should can give us lenses through which to think through questions. And the deeper questions that are at stake in this tshuva are sort of, what are the boundaries between health and illness, and also what are the boundaries between illness and death. And that may sound like a stranger one, but I actually think that there is some lack of clarity on that end too. And so this gave rise to a number of questions. Cancer is one of many illnesses that raise the question of what does it mean to be healed, but also mental illness, terminal illness, chronic illnesses, as well as other ongoing health challenges are other examples that challenge our definition of healing. And long COVID has been added to this list of, when, if we know that people struggle with chronic illness or mental illness, is there a point at which the prayers for someone who is struggling with these things should manifest themselves differently than the prayers for someone who is struck with an acute illness, where somebody is, for example, going through surgery? And then also, on the other side of that, terminal illness. Again, what's that other boundary? And so that's some of the background to the sort of questions that we were trying to lay out. We continue in the tshuva that praying for someone who is ill is actually part of the mitzvah. To pray for someone who is ill is actually part of the mitzvah of Bikor Cholim, of visiting someone who is ill. The rabbis had a sense that when you visited someone, that visit would always entail some sort of prayer for the person's healing. But I also would like to say, and I sometimes say this when we say the Mishaberach, the purpose of prayer, I do not think is to, is to activate. Let me put it this way. I do not believe that the only purpose of prayer is to activate something within God to make God heal people who are ill. Okay, that ideology is something called theurgy. Okay, theurgy is a fancy word. Metallurgy means working on metals, and so liturgy means the working on something. And theurgy is this idea that we can do something that actually will change something in God. I'm not a subscriber to, I don't want to say, that it absolutely doesn't happen that way, because I'm also not God. I don't function in the role of God. So maybe that's how it works. I kind of hope not, but what I will say is that the function of prayer is certainly not only theurgic, and I would argue primarily the function of prayer is to actually activate things within us as human beings. And so part of the function of prayer for people who are ill is to remind us of our duty to visit people who are sick, right? And so, when so that's just sort of one thing to keep in mind. We can pray in any language, but when we say, by the way, refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, we pray for somebody's healing of body and healing of soul. We're acknowledging that, yes, we hope somebody is physically better, but we also can affect people's spiritual state, give them the resources to go through the challenges that they're facing. And I just a little bit of background, a little more background to this. We introduced, this is a little bit of a complicated source, but basically one of the interesting sources about praying for others who are ill comes from Genesis chapter 20. What's the story here? Abraham goes down goes down and is with King Avimelech of Gerar. He does the whole sister thing. Avimelech is told in a dream, "Hey, you better not touch that woman." God tells him in a dream, you're going to die if you do touch her. And then we read, Vayitpalel Avraham El HaElohim. Avraham prayed to God, and God healed Elimelech and his wife and his female servants so that they bore children. For God had closed fast every womb of the household of Avimelech because of Sarah, the wife of Abraham. So what you're told here is that apparently when Avimelech goes out on a date, let's say, with Sarah, God afflicts the whole household. And then Abraham prays for Avimelech and his household to be healed, because after all, Avimelech didn't know what the deal was, and it was kind of Sarah's fault anyways. And the very next thing that we read, so that was the end of chapter 20, and the very next thing that we read in the Torah is that Sarah, God visited Sarah and Sarah became pregnant. Okay? Now those two things in the Torah seem to be unrelated. But Rashi says, following the rabbis, that no. That was a cause and effect. What was the cause and effect? Abraham prayed that Avimelech and his household should be healed from this affliction. And because Abraham prayed for Avimelech, Sarah was able to become pregnant. Okay, and so Rashi develops this idea that it's a little bit complicated or convoluted, but whoever prays for mercy on behalf of another, when that person, him or herself, is in need of the very thing for which you're praying on another's behalf, that person will receive a favorable response from God for what it is that you need, right? So Abraham wants Sarah to become pregnant. So Sarah becomes pregnant. Why? Because Abraham first prayed that Abimelech and his household should be healed and that they should be able to have children. Okay. Now, let me say, we all know that that's not how pregnancy works. We all know that that's not how prayer works. But the rabbis are deriving from this. As I say here, the teaching seems to argue for an instrumental or utilitarian value of prayer. I don't think that that's helpful for us, but we can understand the teaching more broadly as saying that the prayers for others are praiseworthy and of inherent value. In other words, there's something just of inherent value for when we pray, when we keep other people in mind, right? When we pray for others, okay? So that's like a little bit of background about sort of prayer and people praying for someone who is ill. And now I'm going to get into the nitty gritty, but let me take a moment and just stop and check in and see if there are thoughts, responses. If you're saying to yourself, my God, why did I sign up for this? So this isn't what I thought, or, then I don't know, you can just quit. But I'm curious, are there thoughts, responses, things that this has awakened within people that you'd like to share? Susanna?
It has me thinking about the importance, I guess, really of that visiting the ill and making sure that we aren't just relying on prayer, and that a lot of what can actually help people to heal is feeling connected, and especially as we're coming out of pandemic, the importance of physically showing up, like you're talking about going to where you're going to teach next month, and that's those important things of how we integrate the both.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Right. Others? Are there, and I'm just curious, are there particular things that you hope are addressed in the tshuva? Obviously I can't change the tshuva now because it was passed and everything like that, but I'm just sort of curious, are there particular questions that you're most curious about, or you just want to see me plunge forward? Mike, does this happen to you where you just stun people into silence? Yeah. Okay, it's a little unnerving. All right, okay. I'm going to move us forward, okay? But feel free to, raise your hand, ask questions as we go.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Do you feel that just knowing that others were praying for you and Jen added to your feeling supported throughout?
Yeah, I do. And I'll, I can say personally that it was helpful to me. Again, I don't have a theology where I'm saying to myself, because everybody was praying, God must have smiled and, made the cancer go away. I sort of want to name that and push back against that sort of instrumentalization of prayer. But I do think that there's something very powerful, and I find that when I share with people that I am keeping them in my prayers and thinking about them, that in and of itself is also a comfort. So let me move us forward. The next section of the tshuva raises the questions of sort of what are the various ways in which we in which we fulfill the mitzvah of praying for those who are ill. Okay. The the one that we're most familiar with is the Mishaberach list. Okay, the Mishaberach, which is said in community on Shabbat mornings, and sort of said publicly. And I think the thing, I've written a little bit about this here. Communal prayer refers primarily to the practice of reciting the Mishaberach for those who are ill as part of the Torah reading, or I should say, reciting the Mishaberach as part of the Torah reading. Anyways, I hope I didn't have a dangling modifier. The standard practice is that the rabbi or the gabbai recites the liturgy, and then there's a reading of a list of names, and people then can also offer additional names either by telling them to a gabbai who repeats them, or, as is my practice, the practice in our community, I invite people to stand in their place and go around the room, and people say the person's name, and actually even if they feel comfortable, their relationship to them. Let me just say at the outset, I far prefer that practice to the practice of the gabbai or the rabbi either repeating names that people say, or reading the list, because I think that repeating the names that people say gives the impression that there's something magic about the person who's saying the Mishaberach saying the name, and I don't think that we should be. That's not something I believe in. I don't think that it's a theology that we should be fostering. And I also want to make people active participants in their prayer life and in the process. And so I think it's far more important for people to stand and to say someone's name rather than for the gabbai or the rabbi to say it for them. Richard?
Yeah, I have a question about that. There's in your congregation, our congregation, there's a list outside the sanctuary with the people who we know are needing help, needing prayer. But then when we come in, sometimes those same names are repeated. That sounds like almost the same sort of thing you're saying, doubling the prayer or doubling the recognition. Is that appropriate, or is it wrong, or does it matter?
So I'm gonna get into that a little bit later on, but a short answer to your question is, I think it's very appropriate. To me, sort of the ideal type of prayer in the communal prayer experiences, I, as an individual, am in the congregation. There is a moment of communal prayer for that person, and whether or not their name is listed on the board outside, if they have given me permission to pray for them publicly, I stand and I say their name, right? And I even say my relationship to them. And I don't think that there's anything duplicative about that. Because again, I think part of the purpose of prayer is part of what you are doing in that moment is not only calling the community's attention to the fact that this person is sick and needs support, but you're also calling attention to the fact that you know somebody who is sick and you yourself may be in need of support, right? And so you're standing and saying, or even if you're not in need of support, maybe you are a person who is visiting that person, and you have a better sense of what the resources are that person needs. And so you could be a conduit for information. In other words, the moment of communal prayer, to me, the most important function that it does is that it helps to fulfill the mitzvah of visiting the sick. And when anybody stands up and says, I know somebody who is sick, I'm praying for that person, my hope is that at Kiddush or, during the Haftarah, somebody will go up to you and say, could you tell me more about that? Or, hey, how is that going? And hey, what do you need? Right? That to me is a really, really important function that So I don't think it's at all duplicative, and I don't think it's a problem because it's being done by the people who are there. Okay. Let me just also say that there is individual prayer, right? We should know that there are other ways to pray for people who are ill besides the communal prayers. Individual prayer refers to the individuals praying for the healing of others, either by including people's names in the 8th blessing of their recitation of the Amidah. So I want to make sure people know the weekday prayer, the weekday Amidah prayer, specifically has a blessing, right? It begins Rifa'enu Adonai v'nei Rafah, heal us Adonai and we shall be healed. And in that, there's even a particular part where you can say a specific prayer for specific people. Okay. So if you have a practice of regular prayer, you as an individual can include someone in that liturgical moment. But you don't even need to sort of do that official thing. Anybody can say Psalms or just pray for someone, just from the heart, as easy as I'm thinking of this person. God, please protect them and give them healing. Okay, that's a prayer. Okay, sometimes, because we have such liturgy, we sort of think that if we quote unquote just pray from the heart, that somehow we haven't, we haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. And no, right? Like that's the rabbis say you can pray in any language and you don't need the liturgy all the time. Suzanne, I'll take the question, but let me just read one little thing here. In terms of individual prayer, okay, one conclusion of this tshuva is that individual prayer for a person who is ill can take place either with or without anyone's knowledge, including, and I'll even say not only knowledge, but consent of the person who's being prayed for. Okay, this may sound strange, but I believe that even if somebody has told you, right, don't pray for me, okay, I do not believe that you're violating any sort of mitzvah, that you are violating any sort of anything by saying an individual prayer that somebody else be healed. Okay. And the person doesn't need to know or even consent that you've done that. That is always available. And I don't think that there should be any limits on that, because prayer in general is understood as a wonderful thing, right? Just a wonderful thing. One of those rare things in life that really shouldn't have a downside. Okay, Susanna, go ahead, and then I'm going to go on to some of the more complicated issues.
I thought that there had been something on the previous page that said that we should pray in Hebrew unless it's in the presence of the person. So I was just curious about you expanding on the praying in English, because then you had now said that it's okay to pray in English.
So Judaism always has a preference for Hebrew, right? We believe it's the holy tongue. It has a special place in God's heart. And so if we're able to, that's always a wonderful thing. But too often that encouragement and even preference for Hebrew prayer gets read as prayer in other languages is either not allowed or not good. And that's not the case. That's not the case. Okay. I mentioned here a little bit of how it is that we pray for people in Hebrew. In our egalitarian context, I think it's wonderful to pray mentioning the person's name and both of their parents. There is a tradition of often saying, particularly the mother's name, but I think that mothers and fathers can be sources of nourishment, etc. Let me just read one more text, or present one more text as part of this. The rabbis say, and this text comes from Brachot 60b. Actually, so I can pause for a moment. Mike Werbo, would you please read, Rabbi Mike Werbo, upon exiting a bathroom, will you please read that for me so I can take a sip of my drink? You're on mute. You're on mute. You're on mute. You're on mute.
All right. Yep, got it. Upon exiting a bathroom, one says, "Blessed who formed a human being It says, blessed are you, our God, who formed a human being in wisdom and created in him many orifices and cavities. It's revealed and known before the throne of your glory, that were one of them to be ruptured or blocked, it would be impossible to survive and stand before you. The Gemara asks, with what should one conclude this blessing? Rav said one should conclude, blessed is God, healer of the sick. Shmuel said, Abba, Rav, has rendered everyone sick. Rather, one should say, healer of all flesh. Rav Sheshet said one should conclude, who performs wondrous deeds. Rav Papa said, therefore, let us say them both, healer of all flesh, who performs wondrous deeds.
Okay. So first of all, this is where our practice comes from. For those of you who don't know, there's a prayer after you go to the bathroom. Okay. And for anybody who's ever had an orifice blocked or had an orifice open, that that shouldn't be blocked or shouldn't be open, this is a really very down to earth. Oh yeah. Okay. This blessing is, it is a miracle that our bodies function. And it is actually I find it to be a very remarkable blessing to say on an ongoing basis. Our practice is to end that blessing by say, Baruch ata Adonai rofecho basar umaflia la'asot, which we acknowledge God as a healer of all flesh and who performs wondrous deeds. The thing that I want to point out here is that it is Shmuel's reaction to Rav's initial suggestion. Rav's initial suggestion is to say, well, when you finish going to the bathroom, you should acknowledge God as a healer of those who are sick. And Shmuel says, hey, wait a minute. If you do that, then everybody is sick. Okay, because everybody goes to the bathroom, right? A friend of mine has in their bathroom in the, at the home, one of these books, Everybody Poops, right? So everybody goes to the bathroom, right? And if your blessing after going to the bathroom is Rofeh Cholim, is we praise God who heals those who are sick, then Shmuel is saying you've made everybody sick all the time. And so that's actually rejected. We don't say Rofeh Cholim every day, right? We say Rofeh Chobasar, God heals all flesh, right? In other words, we can acknowledge the miraculousness of orifices opening and closing and sort of our bodies working well without making everybody sick. And I wanted to include this because we write here, it may be instructive for this text to be taught to a community so that members avoid asking to be prayed for, or avoid praying for others when the body functions normally. Not every scrape or cold requires a prayer for healing. Okay, so here, again, I don't think that God is going to strike you down if you say an extra prayer for something, but I do think that it's helpful for communities to, and for us to keep in mind that there is a normal functioning of the body, right? Certainly going to the bathroom, but also, people get colds, okay? People fall down and they get scrapes, and not everything that goes wrong sort of requires, oh my gosh, I better say a prayer. Okay. The rabbis did have a sense that when you're praying for someone to recover from illness, that that illness is defined, as something beyond sort of the regular functioning of the body, right, on a day-to-day basis. Right. So that's like one little boundary over here, right? Again, I'm not sure that we would say you're forbidden to pray for somebody or for yourself when you have a cold, but I do think that every person has to sort of say to themselves, is this something where I am ill and it's maybe episodic? It's like a certain moment where I am in need of prayer, or is this something that you know what, this is my regular functioning, right? This falls into my regular functioning. Part of what's going to become tricky about that is, as I listed above, well, what about chronic illnesses, right? And so, and I'll deal with that a little bit lower. But what about sort of things where a person actually they just don't function, you know, in a way that's normal, right? Or that most people consider normal. Okay. So what are the issues that we have to deal with in terms of praying for, you know, praying for somebody who is ill? The most important thing that I want to emphasize is this first one, which I've labeled here as consent. Okay. I'm going to walk you through a few sources. There's a Mishnah in Yoma which reads as follows. One who is ill, this is on Yom Kippur, we feed him under the guidance of experts. And if there are no experts present, we feed him until he says enough. Okay. So this is Yom Kippur. The important thing to take away from this is on Yom Kippur, if someone is ill, it is not up to that person to decide that they want to fast anyways. Okay. The Jewish tradition here actually is taking away autonomy, right? Because the verb here is ma'achilin, right? Ma'achilinoto. They feed him. That person is to be fed, and al pi biki'im, not, well, do they feel like they need to eat? No, if a doctor says you need to eat on Yom Kippur, then you must eat on Yom Kippur. It's not that you're permitted to eat on Yom Kippur, you must eat on Yom Kippur. Okay. So that would seem to say that actually, discretion about this is not left up to the individual. We have a colleague, Rabbi Josh Kahan, who's the son of Rabbi Leonard Kahan, alav shalom, who was my rabbi when I was growing up in Potomac, Maryland, in Har Shalom, who wrote a whole article about this. And one of the things that he wrote about is that while that's the case, it's also the case that, I'm going to read here Josh's words, patient self-knowledge has played a not insignificant role in at least one corner of Jewish law, because the rabbis will say in that area of the Talmud, they have a statement, the heart knows its own bitterness. And what Josh argues is that statement, the heart knows its own bitterness, was not merely meant to put the patient on par with doctors and experts, but actually that the patient has knowledge and should be able to participate in the decision, that the patient knows something about herself that no one else, no matter how skilled in the medical arts, knows. Okay. So even though we feed the person on Yom Kippur, the answer is, but there's also something that the patient does know about themselves, and that also has to be respected. Okay. So what does this have to do with praying? What we write here is, in the case of Yoma, the stakes are high. If a person is allowed to define themselves as not ill, they may fast on Yom Kippur and put their health in jeopardy. One can assume this is the reasoning behind the Mishnah's ruling to deny patient autonomy. But in our case, when it comes to individual prayer, we can say that the stakes are lower. We seek to determine who decides when a person is ill and should therefore become the object of our prayers. And what we conclude is that if a patient defines themselves as not ill, okay, our extra prayers are not going to do any harm if they're private. But if I care about a person this is the sentence that I want to emphasize. If I care about a person and I'm worried about their health, even if they do not see themselves as sick, my individual prayers on their behalf, without their knowledge or consent, if it's public, can be seen to be, that's for private prayer, can hardly be seen to be harmful. So if I'm keeping it private, but when it comes to communal prayer, it's much more complicated. If a patient does not define themselves as ill and we include them in their prayer, in the communal prayers, we are denying the person agency in how they define themselves, and we risk embarrassing them publicly. Not that illness is embarrassing, but here I'm going to say that the conclusion of our tshuva is a person should only be the object of communal prayers with their consent. Okay, this would be the equivalent, or maybe not the equivalent, but in the same, this is Pride Month. A person should not out someone else. It is up to the person who is gay or lesbian or queer to decide for themselves when it is that they want to share that with the community. And in a similar vein, it must always be up to people themselves to decide whether or not they define themselves as sick and want to publicly be prayed for. Okay, so that's like one very important decision. And practically, I'm going to read this paragraph. For this reason, community members should not call the synagogue office and place people on the public Mishaberach list. And I'll add here, and you should not stand up in synagogue and say somebody's name without the knowledge and consent of the person who's being prayed for. When people are being prayed for, they should be asked if they want to have their names listed, and even how they want to have them listed in Hebrew or English. And if the communal list is used both orally during services or publicly displayed, patients must give consent for where and how they're listed. And the only exception here would be the case of a public figure. So if somebody a few years ago stood up and said, Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg's name, Aleha HaShalom, but when she was sick, we didn't need to ask Justice Ginsburg if somebody could pray for her, because it was publicly known that she was struggling with an illness. But otherwise, right, you should never stand up and say somebody's name without their consent. And somebody's name, Richard, so the people whose names are listed on the screen in the lobby are all people who have given consent for their names to be listed there. Okay. So that's one thing about consent. Let me stop. Are there questions or responses to that? In some ways it makes a whole lot of sense, but in other ways, that it may be, maybe that's something we hadn't thought of before. Richard, go ahead.
What about, okay, they're on the list in the lobby, but do they think to let you know when to take their name off? And if not, do the people's names stay there too long?
Okay, great question that we're going to get to, but let me tell you the answer ahead of time. Part of what this tshuva recommends is that there is a regular process of calling the people whose names are on the list. However, the main purpose of those calls is bikur cholim, is fulfilling the mitzvah of visiting those who are sick. And you have to make sure that the people who are making those calls are not calling and saying, hi, I'm calling about the Mishaberach list. Can we take you off? Right? Which is just instrumentalizing the list, right? In other words, that's just sort of like checking it off, right? The primary purpose of that list and of those calls is, hi, your name is on our Mishaberach list. I'm making some calls. First and foremost, I want to check in. How are you doing? Right? And is there anything that you need? And as part of that, you can say, would you like us to continue to have your name on the list? Or do you feel like you can come off at this point? right? That can be a question so that you are cleaning out the list, as it were. But the purpose of those phone calls primarily is Bikor Cholim, is visiting those who are sick. It's checking in on people. The other reason why we recommend in this tshuva not having, and we're going to get to this, but basically, well, let me scoot on, and I'm going to talk more about the list. Okay. Any other quick questions before I go on? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Lori.
Well, maybe this is too broad a question. It's about prayer. And I guess I'm just seeing some hypocrisy or some confusion for me about if Jen didn't pray the full time, or you didn't pray the full time for Jen, then it wouldn't mean that she would stay sick or be well because God directly had a hand in her illness or health. So how does that jive with praying for protection if God isn't directly, or praying for health if God isn't directly pulling the strings, as it were? It feels like a contradiction, because I really was with you with the idea of prayer for connection, prayer to kind of go to a place of kind of checking in with our spiritual inner soul. And anyway, so but I don't see how those two things line up together.
Look, I want to acknowledge that some of the language of prayer, I think the very language which we have can become a stumbling block, because we're asking God to do those things, right? May God bless and heal those who are ill. And so I get it, right? Okay, well, that's not the exact language that we're using. The word to pray is a reflexive verb. It means to sort of perform self-scrutiny. Lehit palel, palal is sort of a scrutinizing, and it's something we're to do to ourselves. And Laura, you've heard me say this in other forums. To me, we measure religion based on, does it make us more responsible? Okay, when religion relieves us of responsibility, I tend to become distrustful of religion. And so when I think that praying for God to do something is not saying, it's both an acknowledgement that, wow, you know what, part of illness and part of life is humility. And it's saying I'm not actually in control of everything. And so I'm going to acknowledge that there's a piece of this which is beyond me, right? I think that's an important part for prayer. But the pieces that I can do something about, I'm going to be God's partner and do something about, right? And the basis of Judaism is a covenant. The basis of Judaism is about a partnership with the divine. Susanna, and then I'm going to push us forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I had mine, I put it in the chat. And I think it links actually with that of, if someone's sick on Yom Kippur, especially if it's not something that, they knew ahead of time or whatever, you might be sick and at home and not be able to call someone or do things and get to have that partnership of trying to check in and go, what do I actually need and how do I protect my body in this time? And that importance of having the autonomy and not further beating yourself up for needing water to ensure that you're not going to feel more sick, especially when it comes by surprise.
Yeah, no, exactly. Look, the Mishnah there assumes that there are experts around, right? It sort of assumes, many people there. And that's not always the case. And by the way, part of why you learn a Mishnah like that is so that if you are by yourself, you understand the principles so that you can make decisions for yourself, right? Based upon those principles. Mike, will you do me a favor? Can you throw the link to the tshuva into the chat? That'll, I think you can do that easily, and therefore people can download it for themselves if they want to. So let me keep going here. I want to foreground the words of one of my, I say she was a student of mine, which is just my way of claiming some pride that really isn't mine. The pride is mine, but the accomplishments are not. Rabbi Julie Pelk was a participant in 1999 in a program called Lishma that I started at Camp Ramah in California in my third year of rabbinical school. She went on, she studied at Ziegler and then was ordained by the Hebrew Union College, and she's a wonderful writer and Reform rabbi. And she wrote about her own experience, and I just want to I want to give that space. Let me read this first paragraph. Some people read Refuat HaNefesh as sort of, and Refuat HaGuf as covering all bases, right? Any kind of healing. There are others, however, who have suggested that chronic and mental illnesses are not best served through the traditional prayer. The words of the prayer, along with the traditional wish for refuah shlema, a complete healing, might not apply with a person in this situation. In other words, with either chronic or mental illness. And given that there's a long history of writing Misha Berach prayers for different situations, and we're going to see that below, their modern prayers are welcome additions to our liturgy. Rabbi Julie Pelk wrote about, she went through a terrible brain trauma that has left her with her own disability and her own sort of living situation. She writes here, I think of my coworker with diabetes, a friend with chronic fatigue syndrome, an aunt struggling with chronic clinical depression, classmate with lupus. I think of my own incomplete recovery. To pray for complete healing, right? Refuah shlema, refuah shlema means whole. For those whose ailments cannot and will not ever be completely healed, seems audacious and even offensive. She says, we will negotiate medications, appointments, needs, fears throughout our lives, side effects, and our everyday reality is one of incomplete health, yet we are not entirely sick either, right? So we don't sort of lump everybody into, well, you're sick, right? Because then you're basically saying a person is living their entire life as a sick person, right? So she says to pray for the complete healing of body and spirit is to misjudge the reality of people's lives. And maybe to understand or redefine healing as making peace with one's fate is to alter the meaning of prayer. And it may also serve to ignore our specific kind of suffering and its ever-changing reality. So, you can click to access that, but she actually writes a new prayer that is rooted in the idea of recovering from chronic illness or living with chronic illness. And there are also prayers that have been written for people who struggle with mental illness. And we've included, I'm just going to scroll down really quickly. We've included both of those in an appendix. This one, appendix number 1, that Rabbi Pelk wrote, and this one in appendix number 2 for those dealing with mental illness. And those may be used in a public setting at various times. There may come either a particular service for healing or maybe on a particular day when these prayers are included, but they can also be used privately. They can be, incorporated into some of the language can be incorporated into people's private prayer practice. And again, I think, what we've tried to do is to highlight the importance of that and of the prayer acknowledging the different realities. Moving on, so I mentioned that, like, on the one hand, there's this question of is not everybody is sick just because they go to the bathroom, right? Like there's normal processes of recovery. That's on one end of the spectrum. But there's another end of the spectrum, which is there a point where we should no longer pray for a person to be healed because it's actually not realistic for that to happen? Okay. And this is, I think, a very important question. I'm going to read first a Mishnah from Brachot that is a guiding text for this. One who cries out over the past, and Hatzoek l'she'avar, in an attempt to change that which has already occurred, right? That seems to be the problem here. That is what the rabbis call a tfilat shav, right? Which means a vain prayer, okay? And the implication is you should not say that kind of prayer, okay? So I mentioned before that like individual prayers for somebody's healing, there are almost no boundaries to it, except for this, right? The rabbis actually are pushing us away from offering vain prayers, right? So the examples given here, one whose wife was pregnant and says, may it be God's will that my wife gives birth to a boy, right? That was, from, it would be, or a girl, right? That's a vain prayer. Or you're walking home and you hear the sound of a scream in the city and say, may it be God's will that it's not from my house, right? In other words, there's a fire somewhere. Those are things that have already taken place, and that's a vain prayer, okay? So how does that apply for us? So I'll read this paragraph. Tfilat shav is a prayer over something that has already been determined and cannot be reversed. Many diagnoses of terminal illness can involve conditions where a person can live consciously, even in relative comfort, for months and even years. And in these cases, we, the authors of the Tshuva, would not say that saying a Misha Berach for the person with the terminal illness is tfilat shav, because even though a physical healing is impossible, a spiritual healing is not, right? In other words, even though somebody may physically not get better, there's a lot of healing that can take place during the last weeks, months, years of someone's life when they're living with a terminal illness. And yet there is a risk for loved ones who continue to say Misha Berach, right, at a certain stage of terminal illness, okay? And it's an interesting example. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was a great rabbi in the ultra-Orthodox community, wrote as follows: our master counseled not to increase communal prayer where the doctors had already abandoned hope of healing the ill person naturally, even where there was a great figure. If their prayers would not be answered and the patient would not be healed, there's concern, God forbid, for weakness of faith. What does that mean? It means that essentially, if you know that the doctors have said there is no possibility of this person recovering, it actually is not some great demonstration of faith. It actually may weaken people's faith to encourage people to pray to God for a miracle, okay? Rather, you should pray that God help the patient and help the family, but not for a person. And so this is an example where Rabbi Auerbach seems to basically be saying, right, there is a limit to prayers when somebody is ill and their recovery cannot be expected. And there are other examples of this. And so let me just read this last paragraph. If, God forbid, someone is brain dead, the rabbi's understanding of tfilat shav can be an important guide. And by the way, brain dead here is one thing, but I think we all know of examples where a person is in hospice, and what the hospice people have said is that the person is unconscious. You are giving morphine, you're giving pain relief, but this person is in the process of dying. Okay, While a conversation about whether or not such a person should be kept on the communal list is unimportant, okay, I'm not worried about that. If the family asks, right, can we pray for my loved one's healing? The rabbi can use Tfilat Shav as a framework for helping family members begin the process of mourning and letting go, right? In other words, that question of can we pray should not always, the answer should not always be yes, right? Because sometimes what you have to do is to begin the process of acknowledging, we're not expecting a miracle in a recovery. And I will say that I personally went through this where I was saying, and for Rabbi Werbo, I'm going to give you like a very specific thing that rabbis encounter. I was saying vidui with someone who was, they were just about to remove the person from life support and begin the process of harvesting the organs for organ donation, okay? There was no possibility of recovery. We were saying vidui, and in the vidui, I could not get the words tirapeh et hacholeh hamisukan hazeh refuah shlema, okay, which is part of the vidui list. That this language of there's somebody who's dangerously ill and you do a complete healing. I actually think in that case, you should not use that language, right? Because I actually think it's a tefillat shav. I'm gonna, let me leave that there. But I mention all this to acknowledge there is an outer boundary, and by the way that the rabbis think about this is you are not there. There's another place where the rabbis say lo somchim al hanes. You don't depend on miracles, right? We pray for that which can be reasonably expected. So I talked here, Richard, this is the paragraph about those phone calls to take someone off of a Misha Berach list, that the primary, so obviously you take someone off of the list when they pass away, or if somebody calls and says, you can take me off the Misha Berach list. But if not, you should have a regular practice of reaching out to all of those who are listening. If you're curious, Rhoda Silver is the person who does this for our community. But we need help, and it's an incredible, you can do this from your house, and it's incredibly holy and important thing to do for a community. And it's an easy and very important mitzvah. And so if you're interested in being one of the people who makes those phone calls, again, the purpose of which are not so much the maintenance of the list, but bikur cholim. And if a person, if you call someone and they seem to be fine to you, but they say, no, please keep me on the list, I say err on the side of caution and keep them on. There's nothing lost by having it. Now, that is the case except, and this is another key part of the tshuva for synagogues. Such an open-ended stance does create problems, okay? Because the community has rights too. In some communities, rabbis and gabbaim are handed a list that reaches 40, 50, or even 60 names. And that becomes what the rabbis called a tircha de tzibura, a burden on the community. And the example, tircha de tzibur really is like making the community wait longer than it should. And we argue in this that not only is it a tircha de tzibura, that reading that long list of names, is sort of takes a long time, but that it also enacts a theology that I don't think we need. So what do we mean by that? If the communal list is collected by the synagogue staff, it inevitably includes names of people who are unrelated to the community of people present on any particular Shabbat morning. So Mom, I love you very much, right? But when you reach out to me and you say, hey, there's somebody in California, could you put that person's name on the list, right? Then we have somebody in Durham who has the name, with a name on the list who is related to me, who's related to you, who you know who that person is. But then like there's a name on our list who nobody has any idea who they are, right? And they have no relationship to them. And so I don't have an objection to that name being on the list, but I do have an objection to burdening the community with listening to a list of names of people who they don't know, right? Because it is a burden to the community. Reading that person's name and a long list of such names that are disconnected from the lived present prayer community risks having our prayers appear as magical incantations, that somehow saying a name will magically activate healing within God that will make its way to that person in another part of the world. Okay, and it is true, nobody knows the mind of God and whether or not that our prayers actually work this way, but also how we structure our communal prayers sends important messages about what we believe about God. And I do think that we should avoid teaching our communities what I've labeled here as magical thinking. And so I would argue, we argue in this, that the best practice is to have a list which is publicly posted, a physical list which is publicly posted somewhere, but that when it comes to the Shabbat morning or the communal practice, that names that are included should be only names mentioned by people who are there. And we go about sort of proving that the primary function of these Mishaberach prayers is less, as much as it is to, I don't want to say less than, but as much as it is to pray to God. Let me give you an example of a fun one. Okay, this is a Mishaberach that was offered in Moravia. May the one who blessed our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, Aaron, David, and Solomon, and all the tzaddikim and pious, and all those who abstain and restrain themselves according to the commandments by which Israel has been commanded. May he bless and extol and exalt to the highest every man and woman of Israel who abstains from wine prohibited by the sages. And by the merit of this commandment of restraining from wine prohibited by the sages, may God bless them and their children and grandchildren, etc., etc., etc. Okay. There's another one. This is my favorite one. Mike, we might want to institute this in all conservative synagogues. May the one who blessed our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless all those who restrain themselves from talking in the synagogue during prayer. From the time that the leader says Baruch She'amar through the end of the Amidah. An account of this merit, may the Holy One, blessed be he, hear their prayers and fulfill their desires for good. Amen. Okay. What's very clear from these examples is that the purpose of those Mishaberachs was not so much talking to God as it was talking to the people in the synagogue, right? This was a polite way of saying, would you all please shut up and stop talking during prayers, right? So it's to say that the Mishaberach, right, it's clear from the history of this that the Mishaberach functions not primarily as up down, oh, we pray for somebody's healing. I mean, yes, but it also is about talking to each other, right? And it's encouraging the communal purpose, as I wrote about here, of notifying the community of who is sick and who in the community should be objects of our Bikor Cholim. Okay, so it's very good to make a list public, right? I actually like the way that this is working out. Mike, we have a screen in our lobby that has the Mishaberach list, and we actually keep it up there during the week, and we can update it easily because it's electronic. And what I notice is that people go in and they look, right? And they see who's there. And the hope, now that I'm teaching this class, I'm thinking to myself, maybe I'll put a little advertisement on there, right? The purpose of posting this list publicly is so that you will visit and care for the people who are on this list, right? Because that's the purpose of it, right? And I would argue that that's the purpose of the Mishaberach prayers more largely. So let me conclude just by saying that's sort of a lot of the reasoning, and then the psak is the conclusion, sort of the halakhic conclusions of this. Number one, individuals recovering from illness can consider themselves healthy and therefore no longer in need of prayers for healing. Nevertheless, we should include whoever asks us to in our public prayers, and individually we may pray wherever we think needs healing. Okay, so if we call people, if they want to be on the list, there's no harm in letting people continue to be on the list. We don't need to tell people for themselves, you're healthy now, we're taking you off the list. Okay, right? Let people determine that for themselves. Number two, a person must give consent and to be on the list, and how it is that they're listed, that they are on the list. If the sick person is unable to give consent, then we do think it can be granted by a loved one or a trusted friend. But otherwise, the privacy of the person has to be respected. You err on the side of not including someone if you're not sure. We encourage the inclusion of prayers for those with chronic illness and mental illness, either in communal settings or privately, and in other settings. You can recite a Misha Berach for someone who's terminally ill, but in certain cases, we should know that there comes a point where it's advisable to pray for the person's and their family's needs, but not necessarily for healing, and to be careful of tefillat shav. And then we just encourage the consistent resetting of the communal list. Okay. So I showed you the first and second indexes. Rabbi Robert Scheinberg actually composed a Misha Berach for someone who's terminally ill. That could be said, and then an insertion for the Amidah, if you know somebody who's terminally ill. And then I've included specifically, and Mike, I think this is most for you, but I have tweaked, this is the Misha Berach, this is how we do the Misha Berach at Bethel. Okay, for those of you who are at Bethel, this should be familiar. But we read it in the Hebrew. We invite people while we're saying it in the Hebrew to say the people's names, and then after we finish the Hebrew, I go back and read a translation, and you'll see that in the translation, it's not a direct translation, but what I say is, and I've even tweaked it. This is even tweaked language that we don't yet use. But it says, bless and heal all those who suffer from an illness from which they can recover. Help our community to provide medical aid and emotional support to those suffering from a chronic illness, and grant us wisdom to provide care and company for family and friends coping with a terminal illness. I apologize, this is not what we do, but this is from Rabbi Dorff. He made some suggestions. May the merciful one grant strength to all those who care for others, and may all these forms of medical, emotional, and social support ease the pain and suffering of those who are ill, and let us say Amen. If you want to see the text of what we do at Bethel, we included it in a footnote. Let me just find it. Let's see. Hold on,
Page
I'll find
9.
it real quickly. Yeah. Mike, what I do when I read the translation is I say, bless and heal all those who suffer from illness, from physical, spiritual, and emotional distress, from illness, both acute and chronic. And what I'm doing there is trying to name all of these different types of illness as a way of sort of encouraging us to remember that when we say refuat hanefesh, a healing of soul, and refuat haguf, and that when we say healing, we actually have a lot of different things in mind, and that by naming those things, sort of more people feel included and seen in the experience of prayer itself. Questions, thoughts, reactions? I hope you found this interesting. Susanna, and then and we have about 4 minutes.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you for presenting us first. And second, what is the appropriateness for those with terminal illness, with mental illness, saying these appendices? Is there a different prayer to say when you're including yourself?
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
Is it appropriate to say these prayers when it's for yourself as well, like for mental illness, for terminal illness, or is there a different prayer that should be used by the person?
It's a really good question. I think that it's not addressed directly in the liturgy, so I'll tell you from my own experience. I will, especially, for example, when we say in the Amidah, Rifa'enu Adonai v'nei rafeh, heal us Adonai and we shall be healed, right? We are certainly included in that us, right? And actually you should know that the rabbis, I believe, to double check this, but I'm pretty sure that that phrase Rifa'enu Adonai v'nei rafeh is actually a paraphrase, I think, from Isaiah, who in that setting actually said Rifa'eni Adonai v'ei rafeh, who actually said it in the individual. Heal me, Adonai, and I shall be healed. So all of our prayers are generally said in the communal, but certainly one can pray for healing from God for oneself in the context of the Amidah. And then there are also many other ways beyond sort of the liturgical prayer for praying for healing. I think generally it's not typical that a person sort of says their own name out loud in the communal prayer. And part of what that creates within us is an obligation to make sure that we are creating in our communities, seeing people who are in need of healing. Marguerite asked, I think I answered it, but she asked, what is the recommended procedure for public acknowledgement or notification if the person who is ill is in a coma or otherwise unable to give consent? And as you said, I think if you are a close friend or a close family member, then you can go ahead and do that, as well. Other thoughts, reactions? Lori?
Well, again, this is just a way too big topic to bring up, especially at the hour of 1 o'clock. But I wonder, I get concerned, having spent my entire career as a medical social worker, a clinical social worker, and about people for whom there's lots of secondary gain in being ill. And sometimes support is good, sometimes support reinforces the sick role. And so I worry about keeping somebody on the list if it's really not in their best interest.
So look, I think that you're bringing up a really important question in terms of either codependency or sort of enabling, enabling people in terms of dependency and not encouraging them to take responsibility for the things that they need to do for their own healing. I think I hear all of that, and I probably would say that with all that said, prayer, right, or the communal prayer list is probably not the place where you need to negotiate those things, right? In other words, it's a low cost to put somebody's name
I
on a
can see
communal
that.
prayer list.
I understand. I agree.
But the question of what are the things that what are the things that the community can do, and what are the things that the community cannot do, and what are the things that the individual can reasonably expect other people to support them with, And then what are the things that the community, that the person cannot have reasonable expectations that other people do for them, are important questions that don't get, hashed out in all of this. Let me just say, fine, and that might get hashed out, by the way, in a tshuva that focuses on Bikor Cholim, right? And sort of what are the obligations of Bikor Cholim for a community, and then where do they stop, as well. Let me just say finally, the process of writing a tshuva about this is not to sort of say, okay, we've answered all the questions, right? But I find halakha an interesting way to sort of think about important issues, right? And think about things as they come up. And again, this began from a place of, one thing that I didn't include in the tshuva, Richard, I think you'll appreciate this, is that for a long while, Gladys would continue to stand up in services and to say Jen's name, right? And Jen was like there in services, right? And she had sort of recovered enough to be fine, but Gladys said Jen's name, and it was one of those interesting things where like Jen and I talked about it, and it's like, there's no harm in Gladys saying Jen's name, like, we don't need to tell Gladys, hey, stop praying for Jennifer, like, Gladys is Gladys, and like, prayer is wonderful, right? Like, so, but it raised these interesting questions of like, if somebody else was doing that, and maybe did it without Jen's consent or something like that, how would that feel, right? And it set me off on a process of thinking about what are all of the things that we need to keep in mind as we live a prayer life in community with others, and live a Bikor Cholim life, right? And live a life in community where we are taking care of others who are sick. So, thank you very much for joining me. A reminder, our next Lunch and Learn is in a couple of months from now. It's August 17th. It's at 11:30 to 1 o'clock. I'm not positive, but I think I'll just give you a little preview. There is a Talmudic story that deals with the question of whether and how kings can be put on trial for crimes, and it feels like there might be some relevance to what's going on in the national news. So we'll see. That seems to me like what I'm gonna try and bring forward for our session in August. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good day.
You said how what can be put on trial?
How the sovereign,
Kings. Okay.
how those with power can be held accountable for their
Ah,
for crimes, and what complications that leads to. So, all
Thank
right,
you.
take care, everybody.
Travel safely and well.
Thank you. Bye.